If one wishes to approach the Gospels as they deserve to be approached, one must first lay aside the habitual demand of the modern intellect. Prove to me historically, prove to me externally, prove to me as one proves a chemical process. For what meets us in the Gospels is not written in the tone of ordinary biography. Again and again, one senses that what is described is meant to be read as an event of the soul, as a path of schooling, as an unveiling of those forces which otherwise were guarded within the mystery temples. Indeed, the decisive shift of world history itself lies precisely in this. What had formerly taken place, hidden from outer eyes in the depths of the mysteries, was set before all humanity as a historical deed. The mystery of Golgotha became, in a certain sense, initiation brought out into world history. But if this is so, then it becomes understandable why there must be four Gospels, not as four competing reports, but as four approaches, four lawful perspectives, through which the one Christ event can be grasped. One may say, the same sun is seen through different windows. It is not the sun that changes, but the soul that needs various forms of light in order to awaken its full capacity. And what is demanded of us today is not merely to know something about Christ, but to let the eye within us be transformed into an organ capable of perceiving the supersensible reality of the Christ impulse. To speak in such a way is already to place oneself upon a ground where the Gospels become mystery books. They are composed with inner artistry, with spiritual dramatic intensification, and the events within them are often arranged so that the attentive reader may be led step by step from ordinary consciousness into a deeper hearing of the spiritual word. It is therefore not accidental that when Christ Jesus speaks of what will happen, suffering, being killed, and after 3 days being raised, those around him repeatedly do not understand. Why do they stumble precisely here? Because the language is the language of initiation. It is the old mystery formula, going toward death, lying in the grave, and awakening again, only now transferred from the secluded temple process into the open arena of humanity's destiny. For in the mysteries of earlier peoples, the candidate was led, after long preparation, into a condition resembling death for a certain span. The spirit was outside the physical body, dwelling in supersensible worlds, and then returned so that the soul could carry back memory of what it had experienced without the bodily instruments. Such a one became a messenger of the divine mysteries, not by speculation, but by remembrance of direct supersensible experience. In the gospel narrative, these mystery laws echo everywhere, yet they echo in a new key, because the Christ impulse aims not at a select circle, but at the gradual transformation of the whole human eye, so that it may learn to unite freely with the spiritual world. If we take seriously this character of the Gospels, we are prepared to understand why each Gospel bears the signature of a particular path of initiation. Let us begin, not with a doctrinal scheme, but with a living observation. Human beings do not awaken to the Spirit in one uniform manner. One soul needs to be approached through the clarity of thought, another through the moral intensification of will, a third through the deepening of feeling into compassion, a fourth through an artistic, dramatic experience of destiny, which brings the soul to perceive the spiritual in the turning points of life. The Gospels speak to these different soul doors. They are like four schooling ways that converge in the one point, the Christ. In the Johannine Gospel, the soul is addressed first through the most exalted element, the Logos. Here, the reader is lifted at once into the region where the human being is seen as arising out of the creative Word, and where the Christ appears as the living Logos entering earthly evolution. This is not merely theology, it is a schooling of thinking itself, so that thinking may become transparent to spirit. Such thinking cannot remain the ordinary abstraction that modern humanity practices. It must become inwardly alive, able to carry in itself the warmth of moral and devotional forces until it becomes an organ of perception. And precisely in John, one encounters, if one reads with the proper key, an initiation event set within the narrative, the raising of Lazarus. This is described not as a mere external miracle, but as a mystery process, a 3.5-day death-like sleep belonging to the ancient initiation forms, yet now appearing as a transition into Christian esotericism. The text itself points to this for those who can decipher the veiled language. It speaks of Lazarus as one whom the Lord loved, and in mystery language, this indicates the intimate relation of pupil and teacher, the most inward disciple. Lazarus is awakened as an initiate. He rises from the grave as from an initiation place. And then something of immense significance is intimated. The one whom the Lord loved, who later appears as the special disciple, is connected with the very authorial voice of the gospel. In other words, the gospel itself wishes to say, what is spoken here is spoken out of a Christian initiation received from Christ. Such indications are not inserted for curiosity. They show the nature of John's path. It is a path of awakening the eye to recognize its origin in the Word, and to unite freely with the Christ as the living spiritual reality. In the old mysteries, the initiate carried the supersensible as memory, but the ordinary I within earthly life could not truly unite with the supersensible worlds. It had no inner judgment force for them. John points toward the new possibility that the I can gradually become capable of bearing spirit within waking consciousness, not by losing itself in dreamy clairvoyance, but by strengthening itself through the Christ impulse. If John is the gospel of the Word and of the awakened spiritual cognition, Matthew is the gospel that approaches initiation through the lawful weaving of heredity, peoplehood, and destiny, the stream of blood, the shaping of a line through generations. The soul is led to perceive how this spiritual works in the most seemingly earthbound element, descent, genealogy, the historical preparation of a vessel. In this way, Matthew becomes, for the modern soul, a schooling in recognizing that history is not merely outer event, but revelation of inner spiritual processes. The human being learns to see in the course of peoples and generations the working of guiding intelligences, and the Christ event appears as the culmination of preparatory streams brought into an earthly form. Luke, on the other hand, carries an altogether different key. Here the Christ event speaks to the human heart in a tone of love and compassion. Already in the outline of Luke's cycle, one finds it characterized as the gospel expressing the principle of love and pity, and one senses that the schooling offered is primarily a schooling of feeling, the ennobling of the inner life, the awakening of the capacities of sympathy, mercy, and selfless devotion. This is no sentimental path. It is a precise spiritual discipline of the heart, by which the soul learns to perceive the Christ not merely as concept, but as living force of love that must be freely offered by the I, and therefore transforms the I from within. The Johannine insight that love must become free gift of the I resounds here as moral substance. And then there is Mark, the gospel that can be felt as a mighty spiritual drama. Here, the events are composed with a particular intensification, so that the soul experiences turning points like inner thresholds. One feels why, in Mark especially, the mystery of Golgotha is presented in the aspect of an initiation event that ends the old world and begins the new. The reader is led to confront the inadequacy of outer cognition before the Christ event, exe homo, and thereby to sense the necessity of a new kind of knowledge that must be won by supersensible means. In Mark, the soul is schooled to perceive. The great crisis is not merely moral or political, it is epistemological and spiritual. Humanity must learn again to know spirit, otherwise the Christ remains unrecognized in the decisive moments. Thus, the four Gospels can be experienced as four paths of initiation. John schooling thinking into Logos knowledge. Matthew schooling the sense for lawful destiny through the stream of generations and peoples. Luke schooling the heart into compassion and love. Mark schooling the whole soul through dramatic encounter with the threshold between old and new, and with the demand for a higher cognition. But one must not imagine that these are four systems that can be neatly separated. They interpenetrate. The paths are distinct, yet they belong to one organism. For the human being is not a one-sided being. We are thinking, feeling, willing. And we are also a being of destiny, who must pass through crises. The Gospels, in their fourfoldness, address the total human being. In order to take a first step toward making this real, one may practice an inner attitude while reading. Instead of asking first, "What do I think about this?" one asks, "What is being done to my soul by this composition?" One notices where the text wants to awaken awe, where it wants to intensify conscience, where it wants to deepen compassion, where it wants to confront us with the mystery of death and resurrection as an inner transformation. Then slowly, one begins to sense why it is said that the Christ event is not merely a doctrine, but a deed that changes the structure of human consciousness. The I must become capable of receiving the spiritual world within itself, no longer by leaving the I, but by strengthening it. And precisely here we come again to that motif which shines out in the interpretation of initiation. The old initiate had to be lifted out of the body. He lived outside it and returned bearing remembrance. In the new time, the decisive impulse is that the human being is to carry spirit into earthly waking life, to let the I become the bearer of conscious spiritual perception. This is why the Gospels can be read as initiation narratives, not in the sense that they offer secret techniques, but in the sense that they describe, each in its own key, the lawful stages by which the human soul may awaken to the Christ within world evolution. So, when one speaks of the four Gospels as four paths of initiation, one should hear in it a practical demand. It is not enough to admire the profundity. The Gospels require the reader. They require that we transform ourselves into organs capable of receiving what is there. The same words can remain dead letters for the one who reads only with external intellect, but they become living spiritual realities for the one who begins to read with the whole being, thinking warmed by devotion, feeling clarified by truthfulness, will strengthened by moral resolve. When one continues more deeply along this path, it becomes clear that Steiner does not speak of initiation in an abstract or symbolic sense, but as a real transformation of the soul's faculties. Initiation, in the Christian sense, no longer consists in withdrawal from the world into secluded mystery temples. It unfolds within life itself, through a gradual reordering of thinking, feeling, and willing. The four Gospels are therefore not manuals of technique, but living spiritual documents that work upon the reader in different ways, depending on which soul forces are most ready to awaken. In the Gospel of Matthew, initiation proceeds through the schooling of destiny consciousness. Steiner emphasizes that Matthew begins not with lofty cosmic images, but with a genealogy. This is not accidental. It directs the soul to perceive how the spiritual works through heredity, bloodlines, and the historical continuity of a people. For the modern soul, which often experiences history as accidental or meaningless, Matthew becomes a discipline in learning to read necessity and purpose within outer events. The Christ is shown as entering humanity through lawful preparation, through generations that gradually form a vessel capable of receiving him. In this way, Matthew educates the soul to sense the spiritual intelligence at work behind historical processes. This schooling is itself initiatory because it transforms the way the human being experiences fate. What is ordinarily felt as blind necessity or injustice can begin to be recognized as meaningful, though not in a simplistic or comforting way. Matthew does not abolish suffering. Rather, it places suffering within a context in which the I can learn to carry responsibility across time. Steiner points out that such a perspective awakens a new moral strength. The soul learns to stand upright within destiny, neither rebelling blindly against it nor passively submitting to it. This is a path of initiation suited to those who seek to awaken through an understanding of karma and historical responsibility. In Luke, the path of initiation turns inward toward the refinement of feeling. Steiner repeatedly stresses that Luke is the gospel of compassion, of the healing forces of love, of the childlike purity that can still receive the divine without distortion. Here, the Christ appears not primarily as cosmic logos or fulfillment of historical streams, but as the healer of broken human hearts. Luke's narratives work upon the soul in such a way that sympathy, mercy, and selfless devotion are gradually deepened. This is not sentimentalism. It is a precise moral schooling. Initiation through feeling requires a particular discipline. The soul must learn to purify emotion so that it becomes receptive to spiritual truth rather than overwhelmed by personal reactions. Luke accomplishes this by repeatedly placing the Christ in situations where love must be freely given, toward the poor, the sick, the outcast, and even the enemy. Steiner indicates that this gospel educates the astral body, transforming instinctive sympathy into conscious compassion. Through this process, the I gains a new capacity. It can unite with the Christ not through intellectual recognition alone, but through a heart that has learned to love without possession. In contrast to Matthew and Luke, the Gospel of Mark strikes the soul with elemental force. Steiner characterizes Mark as the most dramatic and compressed of the Gospels. Events follow one another rapidly, often without explanation. The effect upon the reader is intentional. The soul is repeatedly brought to a threshold, forced to confront the inadequacy of ordinary understanding. In Mark, initiation proceeds through crisis. The soul must experience how its habitual ways of knowing and judging collapse when faced with the Christ event. Steiner points out that Mark speaks powerfully to the will. Here, the Christ appears as a being whose presence immediately calls forth decision, movement, confrontation. The healings, the exorcisms, the conflicts are not presented as moral lessons, but as realities that shake the soul out of complacency. This gospel initiates by placing the human being before the question, can you act out of spiritual insight when all outer support fails? The mystery of Golgotha appears here not as a theological doctrine, but as the supreme crisis of consciousness, in which humanity must either awaken to spirit or sink into spiritual blindness. John, finally, stands apart in its explicit esoteric character. Steiner emphasizes that John does not primarily describe outer events, but inner processes of consciousness. From the opening words, the soul is lifted into a realm where thinking itself must become transparent to spiritual reality. The Logos is not presented as a concept, but as a living creative force in which the human I has its origin. Initiation here consists in learning to think in such a way that thought itself becomes an experience of spirit. The raising of Lazarus, as Steiner explains, is central to this path. It is not merely a miracle, but the depiction of an initiation process transformed by Christ. The old mystery forms appear here in a new light. The initiate does not withdraw from the world, but is awakened so that he can bear the Christ impulse consciously within earthly life. John thus points to the future of initiation, in which the I becomes strong enough to unite freely with the spiritual world, while remaining fully awake and morally responsible. Seen together, these four paths form a complete schooling of the human soul. Matthew educates the sense for destiny and historical meaning. Luke refines the heart and moral imagination. Mark strengthens the will through crisis and decision. John awakens thinking into Logos consciousness. Steiner emphasizes that modern humanity needs all four. One-sided development leads either to abstraction, sentimentality, blind activism, or mystical withdrawal. The Gospels offer a balanced path in which the whole human being is addressed. Thus, the four Gospels stand as four genuine paths of initiation, not because they offer secret formulas, but because they transform the reader, provided the reader is willing to engage them as living spiritual realities. Initiation in the Christian sense is not something one has or achieves. It is a continual process of becoming, and the Gospels, read in this light, become companions on this path, shaping the soul step by step toward a free and conscious union with the Christ impulse at the center of human evolution. When one allows the fourfold nature of the Gospels to work inwardly over time, a further dimension becomes apparent. Each path of initiation corresponds not only to a soul faculty, but also to a stage in the evolution of human consciousness itself. Steiner emphasizes that the Gospels are not merely meant to be read individually according to personal preference, but to be understood as a unified organism reflecting the lawful development of humanity from pre-Christian times into the future. In this sense, they describe both the biography of Christ and the biography of the human soul. In the ancient mysteries, initiation was reserved for those who had been carefully prepared and selected. The soul was led step by step away from ordinary perception, beyond the threshold of death, and then returned with a transformed relationship to the spiritual world. With the mystery of Golgotha, this path was fundamentally altered. Initiation was no longer to take place outside earthly life, but within it. The Christ entered human evolution so that the I itself could gradually become an organ of spiritual perception. The four Gospels depict different aspects of this new initiation, each one speaking to a distinct need of the evolving human soul. Matthew addresses a consciousness that is still deeply bound to the outer world and to inherited structures, family, people, tradition, and law. The initiation offered here begins with learning to see spirit within these very structures. The soul is educated to recognize that what appears purely external, genealogy, social order, historical sequence, is permeated by spiritual intention. This is essential for a humanity that has descended fully into material existence. Without such schooling, the modern soul risks losing all sense of meaning in history and destiny. Matthew restores the capacity to perceive moral purpose in the unfolding of time. Luke, by contrast, speaks to the soul that has already become inwardly separated from traditional forms and now risks isolation or coldness. Here, initiation takes place through the reawakening of warmth. Steiner points out that Luke places great emphasis on childhood, on shepherds rather than kings, on the lowly and the suffering. These images work deeply upon the astral body, refining it so that it can become an instrument of conscious love. The Christ is revealed as the healer of the human heart, and initiation here consists in learning to let the I act through compassion rather than self-assertion. Mark addresses yet another stage, the soul that stands in the midst of crisis. This is the consciousness of humanity at the turning point when old supports fall away and new ones have not yet been fully established. Steiner emphasizes that Mark's gospel is permeated by urgency. The word immediately appears again and again. This is no stylistic accident. The soul is placed under pressure, forced to respond, to decide. Initiation through Mark is initiation through confrontation with the abyss, through the realization that ordinary knowledge and morality are insufficient to grasp the Christ event. Here, the human being experiences the threshold in its starkest form. The Christ is misunderstood, abandoned, denied. Even the disciples fail to comprehend what is taking place. Steiner stresses that this is not meant to diminish them, but to reveal a universal human condition. Mark initiates by showing that the path to spiritual awakening passes through the collapse of false certainty. Only when the soul recognizes its own blindness can a higher form of knowing arise. John then leads beyond this collapse into a new mode of consciousness. Steiner repeatedly emphasizes that John presupposes a certain maturity of soul. It speaks to a humanity that has already passed through doubt, suffering, and moral struggle, and is now capable of awakening thinking itself as a spiritual organ. In John, the Christ does not merely act, he reveals his being. The I Am speaks directly into human consciousness, challenging the soul to recognize its own spiritual origin. The initiation offered here is subtle and demanding. It requires that the human being take responsibility for the quality of his thinking. Thought must become inwardly honest, morally purified, and free from egotistical distortion. Only then can it become transparent to the Logos. Steiner emphasizes that this path is essential for the future of humanity. Without it, spiritual knowledge degenerates either into abstract speculation or into uncontrolled visionary experience. John offers a middle path, fully conscious, fully awake spiritual perception. What becomes clear through this fourfold picture is that the Gospels are not redundant. Each one compensates for the limitations of the others. Matthew prevents John from becoming detached from earthly reality. Luke prevents Mark from hardening into severity. Mark prevents Luke from dissolving into sentimentality. John prevents all three from remaining bound to pre-spiritual modes of consciousness. Together, they form a balanced schooling for the whole human being. Steiner emphasizes that the task of the modern seeker is not to choose one gospel and ignore the others, but to allow all four to work in harmony. This is not achieved through hurried reading or intellectual comparison, but through repeated, meditative engagement. Over time, one may notice that different passages resonate at different moments in life. This is not arbitrary. It reflects the fact that the soul itself moves through phases, and that the Gospels meet the soul where it stands. In this way, the four Gospels reveal themselves as living companions on the path of initiation. They do not impose doctrine, they invite transformation. They do not demand belief, they awaken capacities. And they do not lead away from the world but back into it with a deeper sense of responsibility, freedom, and spiritual presence. When the four Gospels are approached in this living way, another decisive insight emerges, one that Steiner repeatedly emphasizes. Initiation in the Christian sense is inseparable from freedom. In the ancient mysteries, initiation was bestowed upon the pupil by the authority of the Hierophant. The pupil was led, guided, and protected through the supersensible worlds. After the mystery of Golgotha, this structure could no longer remain the same. The Christ impulse entered human evolution, so that initiation might gradually become a matter of the human I itself. The four Gospels, therefore, do not initiate by command or by technique, but by awakening inner responsibility. This is why the Gospels never compel understanding. They speak in images, parables, and dramatic sequences that require active participation from the soul. Steiner stresses that the Christ never forces recognition. Even after the resurrection, he is not immediately recognized. He must be discovered inwardly. This is the hallmark of the new initiation. The soul must come to insight freely, through its own inner work. The four Gospels are structured so that they meet the soul at different thresholds of this work, offering guidance without coercion. In this light, one can also understand why contradictions and differences among the Gospels are not flaws, but necessities. A single, uniform account would have appealed only to one mode of consciousness. Humanity, however, is not uniform. The fourfold gospel mirrors the fourfold human being and the fourfold path by which the I can awaken. Steiner emphasizes that truth in the spiritual realm is not exhausted by a single description. It requires multiple perspectives that can only be unified through inner activity. Thus, the reader is drawn into the work of synthesis, an essential aspect of initiation itself. Another crucial aspect is that the four Gospels not only describe initiation, they themselves work as initiators. Their language, rhythm, and imagery are formative forces. Repeated engagement reshapes the soul's capacities, often without the reader being immediately aware of it. Steiner indicates that this is particularly true when the texts are approached with reverence and patience, rather than with the desire for quick conclusions. Over time, the Gospels can awaken new organs of perception, enabling the soul to sense spiritual realities that previously remained abstract or distant. This also explains why Steiner insists that the Christ impulse cannot be grasped merely intellectually. Knowledge alone does not suffice. The Gospels address the whole human being. Thinking must be warmed, feeling clarified, and will strengthened. Initiation unfolds as these faculties are brought into harmony. The four Gospels provide the archetypal schooling for this harmonization. Each Gospel emphasizes one aspect, but none stands alone. Together, they guide the soul toward balance, which is the precondition for genuine spiritual cognition. In the modern age, this fourfold initiation takes on a particular urgency. Humanity stands at a point where materialistic thinking has reached great precision, but has also become inwardly empty. Steiner points out that without a renewal of spiritual cognition, this condition leads to cultural and moral crises. The four Gospels offer not a retreat into the past, but a path forward. They show how the I can become strong enough to carry spiritual reality consciously, without losing clarity or freedom. Seen from this perspective, the four Gospels are not merely texts to be interpreted. They are thresholds to be crossed. Each one challenges the reader in a different way, to recognize meaning in destiny, to awaken compassion, to endure crisis without losing direction, and to transform thinking into an organ of spirit. None of these challenges can be avoided if the human being wishes to approach the Christ impulse in a living way. Thus, to speak of the four Gospels as four paths of initiation is to point toward a living task. The task is not to master a teaching, but to undergo a gradual inner transformation. The Gospels accompany this transformation by revealing again and again that the Christ event is not finished. It continues wherever a human I freely chooses to unite clarity of thought, warmth of heart, and strength of will with the spiritual reality that entered earth evolution through the mystery of Golgotha.